The winter had already defeated 3 truck batteries, 2 snowplows, and the heating system at Hollow Creek Elementary before the second week of November was over. It had turned the road silver before dawn and frozen the river behind the church hard enough for local boys to throw rocks across it without hearing a splash. It had also brought half the town through the doors of Cole Auto Repair. The garage sat at the far western edge of Hollow Creek, where the streetlights stopped appearing consistently, and the mountains became larger than the sky behind them. It was a narrow 2-bay building that had once been a grain storage shed sometime in the late 1960s, and underneath the permanent smell of engine oil and welding smoke, there was still the faint scent of old cedar buried deep in the walls. The sign outside was hand-painted. The windows rattled when the wind came down from the mountains, and every tool inside the garage hung in perfect alignment. Wrenches, arranged by size. Sockets labeled in faded white marker. Diagnostic cables rolled tight enough to look measured. Nothing in the garage was expensive. But everything inside it was cared for with the kind of precision people usually reserved for surgical instruments or religious objects. Ethan Cole ran the garage the way he ran everything else in his life. Quietly, without explanation, without asking anyone to notice. Ethan was 38 years old and carried grief in the physical way. Some men carry old injuries. Tall, lean, broad-shouldered from years of lifting engines and transmissions by hand when machinery failed or money ran short. Dark hair threaded with early gray near the temples. His face was sharp around the jaw, permanently tired around the eyes. He looked like a man who slept lightly and trusted slowly. He wore old work shirts rolled to the elbows even in winter, and his hands were marked with small scars from years of metal edges and heat burns. Customers noticed his silence before they noticed anything else. Not rude silence, not angry silence, just the silence of someone who had learned there were very few things worth saying twice. When people asked how long he had been fixing cars, Ethan usually answered, "A while," which was technically true if you ignored Detroit, if you ignored the engineering journals, if you ignored the photographs that still existed somewhere online of Ethan Cole standing beside prototype hypercars under convention center lights, while reporters wrote words like visionary and revolutionary beneath his name. In the bottom drawer of the old metal desk beside the office heater sat a thin black magazine wrapped beneath unpaid invoices and registration papers. The cover read, "Ethan Cole leads Velocity Dynamics into the future of American performance engineering." The magazine had not been opened in nearly 5 years. At exactly 4:15 every afternoon, the side door of the garage opened, and Lily Cole stepped inside, carrying a blue backpack covered in marker drawings and stitched repairs. She was 8 years old and serious in the careful, observant way certain children become after spending too much time around adults carrying invisible sadness. She had chestnut brown hair usually tied unevenly behind her head and gray eyes that missed almost nothing. She looked like her mother around the eyes. Ethan noticed that every day. Lily always sat on the same wooden stool beside the tool cabinet after school. The stool had once belonged to Ethan's father, and one of its legs remained slightly shorter than the others no matter how many times Ethan tried fixing it. From her backpack, Lily removed a thick blue sketchbook. Inside were hundreds of drawings. Cars with transparent roofs, snow vehicles designed for mountain roads, engines she invented herself, machines powered by ideas no 8-year-old should logically understand yet. While Ethan worked beneath lifted trucks or replaced frozen fuel lines, Lily sat nearby, drawing quietly, with her knees tucked against her chest. Sometimes she asked questions without looking up from the page. What happens if electric motors overheat faster in high-altitude weather? Or, why do old engines sound warmer than new ones? Ethan always answered her honestly, because he had never learned how to speak to Lily like she was fragile. On the shelf above, Ethan's workbench sat a black-framed photograph, turned slightly toward the wall. Most customers never noticed it. The woman in the photograph was Sarah Cole. Sarah had been 33 when she died. Tall, narrow-faced, intelligent in the immediate visible way. Certain people are intelligent before they even speak. Dark curly hair usually tied messily because she hated distractions while working. Quick smile. Sharp humor. The kind of woman who interrupted professors mid-sentence when she knew they were wrong. She had worked in aerospace systems engineering before meeting Ethan in Detroit during a collaborative electric propulsion project. Sarah loved thunderstorms. Played piano badly but enthusiastically. Drank coffee too late at night. And 5 winters earlier, during freezing rain outside Detroit, a transport truck crossed through a highway barrier and ended Ethan's old life in less than 10 seconds. After that, he disappeared from the automotive industry almost entirely. People online called it burnout, or scandal, or mental collapse. The truth was simpler. A little girl had needed her father more than the world needed another engineer. Around 5 p.m., the front bell above the garage door rang softly. Walter Bennett stepped inside, carrying cold air and cigarette smoke with him. Walter was 72 years old with silver military-cut hair and heavy hands, permanently roughened from decades of construction work after Vietnam. He wore thick flannel jackets year-round and walked with the slight stiffness of a man whose body remembered every winter it had survived. He came to the garage nearly every evening, despite rarely having anything wrong with his truck. Mostly, he drank coffee. Mostly he sat quietly nearby while Ethan worked. Walter understood silence better than most people. His wife and only son had both died from cancer within the same year, 15 years earlier. Since then, he had developed the particular gentleness shared by people who have already buried everything they once thought permanent. "You eating enough?" Walter asked casually. Ethan glanced up from beneath the hood of a Chevrolet pickup. "Probably." Walter nodded once. Conversation complete. Lily held up her newest sketch. "I made this one for mountain rescue teams," she said seriously. Walter studied the page with complete concentration. "Well," he said eventually, "that thing looks expensive enough to bankrupt the government." Lily smiled faintly. At Hollow Creek Elementary, she smiled less often. Children did not entirely know what to do with a girl who smelled faintly like gasoline and talked about suspension systems during lunch breaks. Earlier that week, 2 boys had laughed at her sketchbook during recess. One of them asked whether her father ever talked to normal people. The other called Ethan, that creepy mechanic who lives by the woods. Lily punched him directly in the nose. Not wildly, precisely. Emma Whitmore met Lily afterward, in the principal's office. Emma was 29 years old, with auburn hair usually pinned loosely behind her neck, and pale skin scattered with freckles across her cheeks. She dressed simply long coats, wool sweaters, practical winter boots, and carried herself with the calm patience of someone who genuinely listened when children spoke. She had grown up in Hollow Creek, left for college in Boulder, and returned after her mother's heart surgery 2 years earlier. Emma believed small towns deserved good teachers the same way cities did. She looked at Lily sitting stiff-backed in the office chair with grease stains on her sleeve and dried tears she was trying hard not to show. "You want to tell me what happened?" Emma asked gently. Lily stared at the floor for a moment, then quietly. "He insulted my dad." Emma waited. Lily added softer this time. "He doesn't know him." That sentence stayed with Emma longer than she expected. That night, after the garage closed and the snow began falling softly against the windows, Ethan sat alone beside the workbench while Lily slept in the small room behind the office heater. The garage was silent except for the ticking sound of cooling metal. Ethan opened the bottom drawer of his desk. He looked at the old engineering magazine for a long moment without touching it. Then he closed the drawer again. Outside, snow covered the empty road leading into Hollow Creek. Inside the garage, Lily's blue sketchbook remained open beneath the light. On the final page, she had drawn a car unlike anything currently existing in the world. And beneath the drawing, in careful, uneven handwriting, she had written, "Built by Dad." The prototype had shut itself down at 214 miles per hour for the 3rd time in 8 days. Not gradually. Not with warning lights or rising temperature indicators or any failure sequence the diagnostic software could explain afterward. One second, the Aurelius Valkyrie prototype was delivering nearly 2,000 horsepower through its electric drivetrain on the test track outside Chicago. The next second, the entire system went black. Complete power loss. At 214 miles per hour, the driver barely kept the vehicle off the retaining wall. Inside Aurelius Motors headquarters, 14 engineers had spent the better part of 3 weeks trying to understand why a $12 million hypercar kept dying like a machine that no longer wanted to live. None of them had succeeded. The testing division occupied the lower levels of the Aurelius building, beneath glass executive offices and conference rooms, designed to impress investors. The engineering floor smelled faintly of overheated batteries, soldering smoke, and exhaustion. Large digital displays covered the walls. Diagnostic data scrolled endlessly. Error codes repeated themselves in contradictions. Every system claimed the failure came from somewhere else. At 11:40 p.m. on a Wednesday night, Claire Bennett stood alone beside the silent prototype, with both hands folded tightly across her arms. Claire was 34 years old and carried herself with the controlled posture of someone who had learned very early that competence alone did not guarantee respect. She was tall for a woman, sharp-featured, dark-haired, with pale green eyes that rarely softened during business conversations. People often described her as intimidating before they described her as intelligent. They were usually correct about both. She wore black tailored suits almost exclusively and moved through meetings with the kind of precision that made older executives uncomfortable. Claire had become the youngest CEO in Aurelius Motors history 2 years earlier, after leading the company's expansion into luxury electric performance vehicles. Some board members still referred to her privately as the experiment. She knew that too. The failed prototype sat under fluorescent lighting and matte silver paint worth more than most houses in Hollow Creek. Claire stared at it for a long moment, then finally asked the exhausted engineers around her, "Tell me something useful." Nobody answered immediately. Daniel Hargrove eventually removed his glasses and rubbed both eyes with visible frustration. Daniel was 61 years old, with thinning gray hair and narrow shoulders, slightly bent from decades spent leaning over engine bays and computer terminals. He had worked in performance engineering longer than some employees in the room had been alive. Unlike most of the younger engineers, Daniel had started his career before software controlled everything, which meant he still trusted instinct more than simulations. "The system failure doesn't make sense conventionally," he admitted quietly. "The torque distribution collapses before the thermal spike happens. That shouldn't be possible." Claire looked at him. "What does that mean in English?" Daniel hesitated. Then, "It means the car behaves like the system is reacting to resonance instability instead of hardware failure." One of the younger engineers scoffed softly. "Electric drivetrains don't operate on resonance theory." Daniel turned toward him without irritation. "Most don't." That silence afterward lasted longer than comfortable silences usually last. Finally, Daniel walked toward the prototype and placed one hand gently against the carbon fiber frame. "I've seen something similar once before," he said. Claire straightened slightly. "Where?" Daniel looked at her carefully. "Detroit. About 6 years ago." That got her attention immediately. Daniel walked toward one of the terminals and began pulling archived engineering documents onto the main display screen. A name appeared: Ethan Cole. Several younger engineers exchanged confused looks. One of them frowned. "The hypercar guy who disappeared?" Daniel nodded once. Years earlier, Ethan Cole had developed an experimental torque balancing architecture during his time at Velocity Dynamics. Most companies ignored the research because the system was considered too unstable and too complex for commercial production. Except Aurelius Motors had quietly purchased fragments of that abandoned research through subsidiary acquisitions years later. And now, their $12 million flagship prototype was behaving exactly like Ethan's early experimental simulations. Claire stared at the screen. The photograph attached to the file showed a younger Ethan standing beside a prototype chassis under Detroit convention lighting. Clean-shaven, focused, expressionless in the way highly intelligent people sometimes look when forced into publicity they never wanted. "He vanished after his wife died," Daniel said quietly. Nobody really heard from him again. Claire crossed her arms tighter. "You think he can fix this?" Daniel answered honestly. "I think he might be the only person alive who understands why it's happening." The board meeting the following morning went badly. Very badly. Richard Vale chaired most of it from the far end of the conference table. Richard was 58 years old with silver hair, expensive watches, and the polished confidence of a man born wealthy enough to mistake comfort for intelligence. He represented Aurelius Motors' largest investor group and had opposed Claire's promotion from the beginning. He smiled often during meetings, never warmly. "You assured us this prototype would debut next month," Richard said calmly. "Instead, we're watching millions disappear into engineering confusion." Claire remained standing near the presentation screen. "The issues are solvable." "Then solve them." The room stayed silent. One board member finally asked, "Is it true 14 engineers have failed already?" Claire answered without hesitation, "Yes." Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. "And now we're discussing tracking down a mechanic hiding in a mountain town because your engineering division can't stabilize its own vehicle." Claire's expression did not change. "Not a mechanic." She glanced once toward Ethan's old file still open on the display screen. "An engineer." Richard smiled faintly. "Former engineer." Claire held his gaze for several seconds, then closed the presentation without another word. That night in Hollow Creek, snow fell steadily across the mountains, while Ethan worked alone beneath a lifted Dodge truck. The garage heater rattled weakly against the cold. Lily sat nearby, drawing quietly, until sometime after midnight, when she woke unexpectedly and realized the small room behind the office was empty. She stepped softly into the garage, wearing mismatched socks and one of Ethan's oversized flannel shirts hanging nearly to her knees. The lights near the workbench were still on. Ethan stood alone beside a steel barrel behind the garage, with several rolled engineering papers burning slowly inside it. Flames reflected across his face. Lily stopped near the doorway unnoticed. One page partially unfolded in the fire before blackening at the edges. Complex drivetrain schematics, mathematical formulas. Her father's handwriting, Ethan fed another bundle into the flames without expression. Not angry, not emotional, just deliberate, as though destroying something dangerous. Lily had never seen him do this before. For a moment, she stared quietly at the fire, illuminating the side of his face against the falling snow. Then she looked down at one half-burned page lying near the barrel. At the bottom corner beside a faded engineering logo were printed words she had never seen before. Lead, Systems, Architect Ethan Cole. Lily looked back at her father. And for the first time in her life, she realized there were entire parts of him she did not know existed. Inside the garage, the heater continued rattling softly against the cold, while snow covered the empty roads leading into Hollow Creek. 2 states away, Claire Bennett sat alone in her office, staring at Ethan Cole's old engineering file long after midnight. And sometime around 1:13 a.m., she made the decision to go find him herself. Claire Bennett arrived in Hollow Creek just after noon, beneath a gray Colorado sky, heavy with incoming snow. The black Aurelius sedan looked strangely out of place on the town's narrow roads, too polished, too expensive, too deliberate among rusted pickups and weather-beaten storefronts. People noticed it immediately. Hollow Creek was the kind of town where strangers became conversation topics before they even parked. Claire stepped out wearing a charcoal wool coat over a black turtleneck, her dark hair pinned neatly despite the wind coming down from the mountains. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman accustomed to boardrooms, pressure, and people underestimating her until it was too late. Cole Auto Repair stood near the edge of town exactly as Daniel Hargrove had described it. Small, quiet, forgettable to anyone not paying attention. Claire stepped inside and immediately smelled engine oil, metal dust, and old cedar buried in the walls. Ethan stood beneath the raised frame of a snowplow truck, tightening bolts with steady mechanical precision. For a moment, he didn't even look up. Then finally, "We're closed." Claire studied him carefully before answering. "Ethan Cole?" Now he looked at her. His expression changed very slightly at the mention of his full name. Not surprise exactly. Recognition of trouble. Yes. Claire walked closer. "I'm Claire Bennett, CEO of Aurelius Motors." Ethan wiped his hands slowly on a rag. "I know who you are." That answer caught her off guard. "You follow the industry?" "No," Ethan said calmly. "The industry follows itself loudly enough." Near the workbench, Lily sat frozen with her sketchbook open across her knees, quietly watching the conversation unfold. Claire noticed her immediately. Lily noticed Claire, too. Children often sensed authority before adults did. Claire removed a thin folder from beneath her arm and placed it carefully on the workbench. "We need your help." Ethan didn't touch it. Claire explained the drivetrain failures, the system shutdowns, the unstable torque synchronization. She spoke precisely, technically, without simplifying anything for him. That told Ethan something important about her immediately. Most executives simplified engineering because they assumed intelligence belonged only to specialists. Claire didn't. When she finished, Ethan remained silent for several seconds. Then, "Dest." "No." Claire blinked once. "No, I'm not interested. You haven't even looked at the data." "I don't need to." Claire folded her arms. 14 engineers failed. That sounds like Aurelius Motors' problem. There was no anger in his voice. That somehow made it worse. Claire stepped closer. "Do you know how much is riding on this launch?" Ethan finally looked directly at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "That's one of the reasons I'm saying no." Outside, wind rattled softly against the garage windows. Lily watched her father carefully. Claire tried once more. "This technology came from your research." "No," Ethan corrected softly. "It came from what corporations bought after I stopped protecting it." That landed harder than Claire expected. For the first time since becoming CEO, she found herself without a prepared response. Walter Bennett entered through the front door, carrying his usual paper coffee cup, and paused immediately when he saw Claire standing inside the garage. Walter's old soldier instincts noticed tension quickly. "You look expensive," he muttered casually. Claire almost smiled despite herself. Walter walked beside Ethan, glanced once at the folder on the workbench, then toward Claire. "You from Chicago?" "Yes." Walter nodded slowly, like someone confirming an old suspicion. "You're wasting your trip." Claire exhaled quietly. "Everyone keeps saying that." Walter took a sip of coffee before answering, 'cause Ethan already buried that part of his life once. Claire studied Ethan again. "You were really that good?" Walter looked at her over the rim of his cup. Back then, people used to call him the man who could hear the soul inside an engine. Class. 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 Grace. Class. 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 Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Walter." But the old man continued anyway. "Most engineers listen for problems. Ethan listened for harmony." Walter shrugged. Machines made sense to him, the way music makes sense to other people. The garage fell quiet afterward. Finally, Claire picked up the untouched folder. "If you change your mind," she said carefully, "call me." She placed her business card beside Lily's sketchbook before turning toward the door. At Hollow Creek Elementary the next afternoon, Emma Whitmore knelt beside a long science club table while Lily carefully adjusted wiring on a miniature electric motor. The after-school science club occupied an old chemistry classroom near the back of the building. Most children joined because they liked rockets or robots. Lily joined because Emma had quietly signed her up without asking whether she wanted to. Emma stood nearby, wearing a dark green sweater, dusted faintly with chalk powder from class earlier that day. You're good at this, Emma said softly. Lily didn't look up from the motor. My dad taught me. Another girl named Sophie leaned closer to Lily's project. Sophie was small, blonde, missing one front tooth, and possessed the fearless friendliness certain children carried naturally, without embarrassment. That's really cool, Sophie said honestly. Lily hesitated, then nodded once. It was the first normal conversation she'd had with another child in weeks. That night, snow fell heavily over Hollow Creek. Ethan sat alone on the back steps outside the garage, while cold wind moved through the pine trees behind the property. Lily stepped outside, wrapped in an oversized blanket. For a while, she sat beside him, without speaking. Then, quietly, if Mom was here? Ethan stared into the snow-covered darkness. Lily continued softly. Would she want you to quit forever? That question hit him harder than Claire Bennett had. Harder than the boardrooms. Harder than Detroit. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing at all. Then, Lily looked up at him. You always tell me engines stop working when people ignore the real problem too long. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Inside the garage behind them, Claire's business card still sat untouched on the workbench beneath the overhead light. And sometime later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Ethan finally picked it up. Exactly 1 hour later, Claire Bennett's phone rang in her Chicago hotel room. This is Ethan Cole, the voice said quietly. I'll give you one night. Ethan Cole arrived at Aurelius Motors just before 9 p.m. Chicago rain streaked across the glass exterior of the research facility, while security lights reflected off black pavement like fractured mirrors. The entire building looked less like an automotive headquarters and more like a government laboratory built to study dangerous things quietly. Claire Bennett met him personally at the lower entrance. Ethan stepped out of his truck wearing the same faded brown work jacket he wore at the garage in Hollow Creek. Oil stains marked both sleeves. His boots still carried dried snow from Colorado. Several Aurelius employees glanced at him without hiding their reactions quickly enough. Claire noticed all of it, but Ethan seemed not to care. Inside the research division, engineers moved between glowing monitors and suspended diagnostic displays, while the silver Valkyrie prototype sat beneath white overhead lighting like an unfinished weapon. The room fell slightly quieter when Ethan entered. Not silent, just observant. One younger engineer whispered something under his breath about small-town mechanics, earning a sharp look from Daniel Hargrove before he could continue. Ethan ignored everyone completely. He walked directly toward the hypercar, slowly, the same way surgeons approach operating tables. For nearly a full minute, he said nothing at all. He circled the vehicle once, hands inside his jacket pockets, eyes tracing airflow channels, battery placement, cooling vents, suspension geometry. Claire stood nearby, watching carefully. You already see something, she said quietly. Ethan crouched beside the rear intake vents. Yes. A few engineers exchanged skeptical looks. One of them, Trevor Lynn, folded his arms immediately. Trevor was 27 years old, brilliant with software architecture, impatient with people, and carried the sharp arrogance common among engineers praised too early in life. He had graduated from Stanford at 21 and believed most mechanical problems eventually became software problems if you waited long enough. We already checked thermal regulation systems, Trevor said. 3 times. Ethan finally looked at him. That's because you were looking for failure. Trevor frowned. That's usually how diagnostics work. Ethan stood slowly. No, he replied calmly. Diagnostics look for interruption. This isn't interruption. D. He placed one hand lightly against the side panel near the battery housing. This is imbalance. That word changed the room slightly. Daniel Hargrove straightened almost immediately. Claire noticed that too. For the next 2 hours, Ethan dismantled portions of the Valkyrie's rear thermal shielding, while engineers watched from nearby stations. He moved carefully, but without hesitation, the way experienced people move when uncertainty no longer scares them. At 1:14 a.m., Ethan finally removed a narrow titanium cooling plate, no wider than 2 fingers. "There," he said quietly. Claire stepped closer. The plate looked almost perfect. Almost. Ethan angled it beneath the overhead light. One edge was misaligned by less than a millimeter. Trevor stared. "That can't shut down an entire drivetrain." "It can if resonance synchronization collapses across the battery network first." Several engineers looked confused. Ethan glanced toward the giant digital thermal display covering the wall. "You designed the system to think like software," he explained. "But energy behaves more like music. If one frequency destabilizes, everything around it compensates, until eventually the whole structure tears itself apart." The room stayed silent afterward. Claire realized nobody had spoken to her engineers like that before. Not because they lacked intelligence, because most people, intelligent enough to explain complex things, simply had no patience left. Ethan still did. For the next several hours, he worked beside Claire almost entirely alone, while most engineers quietly stepped back and watched. At some point around 3 a.m., Claire handed Ethan a coffee, without asking whether he wanted one. "You still love this," she said softly. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Ray tapped steadily against the laboratory windows beyond the city skyline. Finally, "No," he said quietly. "I loved building things with Sarah." That was the first time Claire had heard him say his wife's name out loud. He adjusted the replacement plate carefully beneath the battery assembly. "But this..." He glanced around the laboratory. "This part I tried very hard to stop missing." Claire watched him differently after that. Not as an engineer, not even as a solution, but as a man who had amputated part of himself to survive. Back in Hollow Creek, Lily sat cross-legged on the floor inside Emma Whitmore's living room, while snowstorm winds rattled softly against the windows. Emma's house smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and old books. Small, warm, cluttered in a comforting way. Framed photographs lined the shelves beside stacks of school papers waiting to be graded. A golden retriever named Murphy slept heavily near the fireplace. He was 9 years old, broad-faced, slow-moving, and possessed the patient, exhausted kindness. Older dogs sometimes develop after spending years around children. Lily stroked the dog absent-mindedly beneath his ears. Emma sat nearby, correcting homework assignments with red ink. "You worried about your dad?" she asked gently. Lily nodded without looking up. "I think if he goes back there," she said softly, "maybe he won't come home again." Emma stopped grading papers. For a moment, she studied the little girl beside the fireplace. Then carefully, "People don't usually leave the things they love most." Lily looked toward the snow-covered window. "My mom did." The sentence hit harder than Emma expected. Not because it was cruel, because children often describe death in the simplest possible language. Emma moved closer quietly and wrapped a blanket around Lily's shoulders. And somewhere, far away beneath the cold white lights of Aurelius Motors, Ethan Cole tightened the final bolt beneath the Valkyrie prototype, while something inside him slowly began waking up again for the first time in years. At 4:03 a.m., the Valkyrie prototype came back to life. Not violently, not dramatically. The activation sequence began with a low electrical hum beneath the chassis, followed by the soft illumination of the dashboard systems one by one across the laboratory darkness. Then, the drivetrain engaged. Perfectly. The sound that followed was unlike anything most people in the room had ever heard before. Not the aggressive roar of combustion engines or the artificial tones modern manufacturers programmed into electric vehicles to imitate power. This sound was cleaner, deeper. A controlled resonance that seemed to vibrate through the floor beneath their feet, like a living pulse finally finding its rhythm again. Nobody in the control room spoke. Trevor Lynn stared openly at the diagnostic displays scrolling flawless synchronization data across every monitor. Daniel Hargrove removed his glasses slowly, almost smiling to himself for the first time in weeks. Claire Bennett stood beside Ethan near the testing platform, both of them watching the prototype stabilize at full operational output without a single thermal deviation. 14 engineers had failed. 3 weeks of simulations had failed. And one man from a mountain town wearing an oil-stained jacket had solved it in less than a night. Ethan leaned quietly against the workbench, exhausted but calm, as though this outcome had never surprised him at all. Claire looked at him differently now. Not with admiration, exactly. Something more careful than that. Respect. The kind earned only when brilliance no longer needs attention to prove itself. Around sunrise, the Aurelius board members began arriving after emergency calls from the engineering division woke half the executive floor. Richard Vale entered the laboratory first, expensive overcoat draped across one arm, expression tense until he saw the active prototype running flawlessly beneath the lights. For several seconds, he simply stared. Then his eyes moved toward Ethan. Richard recognized immediately what the room already understood. This entire company had just been saved by a man none of them had wanted to acknowledge existed. By 5:30 a.m., conversations about marketing opportunities had already begun. One investor suggested interviews. Another proposed announcing Ethan's involvement publicly before the launch event. "People love comeback stories," someone said enthusiastically. Claire shut the conversation down immediately. "No." The room quieted. Richard frowned slightly. This could help investor confidence. Claire's voice remained calm. He came here to solve a problem, not become a campaign. That answer surprised several people in the room, including Ethan. An hour later, after most executives finally dispersed, Claire found Ethan alone near the observation windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, slowly brightening beneath winter clouds. She stood beside him quietly. "You could come back," she said eventually. Ethan said nothing. Claire continued carefully. "Chief Technical Director. Full autonomy over future development projects. Equity shares if you want them." Outside, snow drifted lightly between skyscrapers. "We could build things nobody else can build," she added softly. For a moment, Ethan almost looked tempted. Not by the money, not even by the prestige, by the work itself. Claire saw it happen in his eyes. Then it disappeared. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly before answering. "I have a daughter waiting at home." Claire studied him for several seconds and finally understood something important. Most people spent their lives chasing purpose because they had never found it. Ethan had already found his. He simply refused to lose it twice. Back in Hollow Creek, Emma Whitmore stood inside the school parking lot, helping children into cars beneath light morning snowfall, when Ethan's old truck finally rolled slowly into town just after sunrise. Lily nearly ran across the sidewalk toward him. Emma watched Ethan step out of the truck, looking exhausted enough to collapse where he stood. His hair was disheveled, eyes shadowed from lack of sleep, jacket still carrying traces of laboratory grease and Chicago rain. But there was something different about him now. Not happier, lighter. Lily wrapped both arms tightly around him without hesitation. Ethan held her carefully against his chest. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Emma looked away politely, though something tightened unexpectedly inside her chest while watching them together. Not pity, not curiosity. Something warmer than either. Ethan eventually glanced toward Emma. Their eyes met briefly across the snowy parking lot. And for the first time since she had met him, Emma realized Ethan Cole was not emotionally distant because he lacked feeling. He was distant because feeling too much had once nearly destroyed him. Later that morning, after dropping Lily at school, Ethan returned alone to Cole Auto Repair. Inside the garage, the old heater rattled softly against the cold while snow continued falling beyond the windows. On the workbench near the tool cabinet sat Lily's blue sketchbook, still open from days earlier. Ethan looked at it quietly. Then, for the first time in years, he pulled the old engineering magazine from the bottom drawer instead of hiding it away again. The first heavy snow of December arrived overnight and buried Hollow Creek beneath nearly 2 feet of white by morning. Road signs disappeared halfway beneath drifts. Storefront roofs sagged under fresh snow. Pickup trucks groaned awake before sunrise, while exhausted men in thick coats scraped windshields beneath pale winter light. By 7 a.m., 3 vehicles were already waiting outside Cole Auto Repair. By noon, there were 7. Word traveled faster in small towns during winter, and somehow the story had spread beyond Hollow Creek. People spoke quietly about the mechanic who had fixed a $12 million hypercar in a single night before driving home like nothing had happened. Ethan ignored all of it. He still charged the same prices, still swept the garage floor himself every evening, still stopped working at exactly 4:15 when Lily came through the side door after school, carrying her blue sketchbook and snow-covered boots. Nothing about him became larger after Chicago. That was one of the reasons people trusted him. Inside the garage, Walter Bennett sat near the heater, drinking burnt coffee while pretending not to watch Ethan work. "You know," Walter muttered casually, "most people become unbearable after getting famous." Ethan tightened a bolt beneath an old Ford transmission. "I'm not famous." Walter snorted softly. "That's because you keep hiding in the mountains." Across town, Emma Whitmore stood beside the elementary school playground while children threw snow at each other during recess. She spotted Lily near the fence, building something alone out of packed snow and broken branches. Not a snowman, a car. Emma smiled before walking closer. "You know," she said gently, "most kids make castles." Lily glanced up seriously. "Castles don't move." Emma laughed quietly. That sound surprised Lily enough that she smiled too. It happened more often lately. 3 days later, just before sunset, an unfamiliar sound rolled through Hollow Creek. Not loud, not aggressive. Smooth. The silver Valkyrie prototype appeared slowly through falling snow like something unreal moving through the mountains. Its low body reflected pale winter light, while half the town stared openly from sidewalks and diner windows. Claire Bennett stepped out wearing a long black coat and leather gloves, dark hair moving slightly in the cold wind. She looked less severe than before somehow, less like a CEO arriving for negotiation. More like someone returning intentionally. Lily came running from the garage almost immediately, stopping frozen beside the hypercar with wide gray eyes. Claire crouched slightly beside her. "You want to sit inside?" Lily looked toward Ethan first. Ethan gave a small nod. That was all she needed. The Valkyrie cockpit glowed softly around Lily as she settled carefully into the driver's seat, like someone entering a spaceship. Her hands hovered above the controls with reverent caution. "It smells fast," she whispered. Claire laughed softly. Ethan heard it. It was the first genuine laugh he had heard from her. Claire eventually handed Ethan a thick, cream-colored envelope. Inside was a formal partnership offer from Aurelius Motors, long-term consulting authority, private development access. Enough money to permanently change his life if he accepted it. Beneath that sat another document, Aurelius Technical Scholarship Program, Hollow Creek Initiative, funding for engineering equipment, science programs, and future scholarships for children across the town. Ethan looked up slowly. "You did this?" Claire folded her hands into her coat pockets against the cold. "You said you stayed because your daughter mattered more than the industry." She glanced toward Lily inside the Valkyrie. "Maybe other kids deserve opportunities too." Braff. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Snow continued falling quietly around them. That night, after the garage closed and Hollow Creek disappeared beneath soft winter silence, Ethan and Lily sat together on the back porch, wrapped in blankets while snow drifted through the pine trees behind the property. The garage lights glowed warmly nearby. Inside the house, Emma's homemade soup sat cooling on the kitchen counter, where she had dropped it off earlier that evening, by accident. Lily leaned gently against Ethan's shoulder. "Are you going to leave?" she asked softly. Ethan looked first toward the old garage, then toward the warm light inside the house, then finally toward his daughter. For a long moment he simply listened to the snowfall around them, and when he smiled, it was small enough most people would have missed it. "I think," he said quietly, "maybe this time, we won't have to do everything alone." Snow continued falling across Hollow Creek long after midnight. Inside the garage, Lily's blue sketchbook remained open beneath the workbench light, beside new engineering papers Ethan had not hidden away again. Sometimes the people carrying the heaviest pain are also the people quietly holding everyone else together. Ethan spent years believing survival was enough. He buried his talent, hid from the world, and convinced himself that love only led to loss. But in the end, it wasn't success, money, or recognition that brought him back to life. It was a little girl waiting for him at home. It was the kindness of people who stayed. And it was the reminder that even after heartbreak, God can still place new light in our path when we least expect it. In everyday life, many of us become like Ethan without realizing it. We keep going to work. We pay bills. We smile when necessary. But deep inside, we stop believing there's still something beautiful waiting ahead. This story is a reminder that healing does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through a child's question, through a friend who understands, through someone who chooses to stay. And sometimes the hardest thing in life is not surviving pain. It's allowing yourself to live again afterward. If this story touched your heart even a little, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what moment in the story stayed with you the most. And if you believe God can still restore broken hearts, comment Amen below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories about family, faith, strength, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, heal your heart, and bring peace to your home tonight. Amen.